Good morning, everyone. I am Allison Zmuda, joined by Bena Kallick as co-directors for the Institute for Habits of Mind. And we are over the moon to be joined by Dr. Fredrik Pferdt, who actually is continuing to inspire us based on an interview that he gave with Dan Harris that I heard on my walk. And about 5 minutes into the conversation, Fredrik, I was just so over the moon. I immediately stopped and bought the book on my walk through the woods. And then as I dove into it, I immediately reached out to Bena and I said, this is what we've been looking for. And the spirit of radical optimism is now our conference theme for our IHUM annual conference. So thank you so much, Fredrik, for joining us, and good morning.
Thank you so much, Allison and Bena. I'm really honored, to join you. And thanks for sharing that little story that you really invest in yourself by going on walks in the forest, right? Like forest bathing. There's research that even like 10 minutes in the woods and outside, do something magical to us, which is like it gives us optimism, right? It gives us hope. It gives us a different perspective, and engaging all of our senses through the smell and like what we see out there, and like just when the sunlight hits our skin, it does something to us physically and mentally. And so thanks for sharing that. And I'm also thrilled that you listened to the podcast with Dan Harris, 10% Happier.
Yep.
And I was speaking with Dan many times actually, and it's just fascinating how he promotes meditating and what it does to him and to many other people who are now following his advice to just have a little bit more to observe a little bit more what's going on in our minds, right? And I think that's something we can all practice more.
And you're coming to us from a beautiful space in California where you started to describe it as your meditation, Zen, and recording studio space, guest room. So it serves multi-purposes. But I think the idea and the synergy between not just the powerful message that is in the book, but also the direct correlation we see to habits of mind. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with habits of mind as a frame, but the idea of the habits of mind are a set of 16 dispositions. And so when we start to think about walking in nature, a part of it is gathering data with all senses and looking at the world with wonderment and awe. I mean, the opportunity to continue to see that kind of connection that truly is so significant, not only with our learners in schools and education, but also with ourselves, with our families. So I think the other interesting piece that when Bena started to interact and we did a little mini book study, she and I, on What's Next Is Now and Habits of Mind, but I also have gifted it to my best friends. I gifted it to my 23-year-old son. I think the opportunity to see the power of thinking about the future. And, when I was walking in the woods, before I stopped and ordered the book immediately, the question that you first asked is, what will the future bring? And I went through that kind of thought experiment, just like you did with Dan. So in my mind, I was thinking about, so what is the future? What does it bring? I started thinking about anxiety and fear and worry and discomfort. And then you paused and said, what future do you want to create? And then it started to change the gears in a way that was actually startling to me, just personally, to think about how that kind of shift in the framing opened up a whole nother set of thoughts and attitudes that potentially started to frame that. So I know that's what my sort of view was, but you've asked this question probably a couple times to audiences in preparation for the book. And since then, what have you seen that is capturing that kind of mood and feeling, especially right now?
Yes, great question, Allison, and thanks for already changing your relationship with the future, right? I think that's very important. I think we have that love-hate relationship with our future, right? Sometimes we have anxiety about it, we feel uncertainty, we feel we worry a lot about the future, right? And sometimes we can't wait to live in the future, right? We're excited about it, right? And so I want to give people a little bit more control over their relationship with their future. And by changing the question about the future, as you just shared, instead of asking what will the future bring, because that's out of our control, right? It's something that is objective, that's out there and so forth. Changing it towards what future do I want to create? You're already changing your relationship, and probably towards a better relationship where you see opportunities, where you see hope, where you see a better future unfolding. And so for me, the key insight is really the future isn't shaped by what we have in our minds. It's shaped by how we use our minds. And the habits of mind framework, is fascinating to me because it's exactly that. It's how we use our minds, right? And so we move away from a fixed way of thinking to an adaptable way, an evolving way of engaging with what's next and moving towards creating what's next, which I think is also very, very helpful when thinking about the future, right? What is in our control and what is not in our control? What can we influence and what can we not influence? And so at its core for me, what's next is really about cultivating this future ready mind state, a way of thinking and being that really enables us to actively shape what's next rather than passively waiting for it to unfold, right? And how often do we just sit there and wait and, the future just happens to us, right? Which is unfortunate because we have a lot of control over what's going to happen next. And I think the habits of mind framework really aligns beautiful with this because it provides also actionable ways to develop that mental agility that we all need to navigate that uncertainty. And one thing that stands out probably is that I don't use the word mindset. I use mind state. And here is why. I think a mindset for me implies something fixed, something we have. And it is like a static trait, right? It's based on our past experiences, on our value system, and so forth. So really things that are hard to change. But a mind state is a dynamic way of looking at that. It's something we practice and cultivate based on how we engage with the world. And to quote Anais Nin, she once said, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are, right? And I think this captures the essence of mind state. The way we perceive the world and ultimately shape the future is really determined by how we choose to think and respond and experiment. And so each of your habits, from like thinking flexibility to listening with empathy, really reinforces the idea that the future isn't predetermined. It's something we create through the way we think, respond, and listen.
It's so interesting that you're saying all of that. I mean, certainly it was very much a part of the way we were thinking when we developed these, based on a lot of research and a lot of thinking about I think the third question that you ask is, then who would you like to be? Who are you becoming? And I think that that's the part I would add into this conversation, just to say that given my age, which is older than both of you, I would say that who you would like to be is also about the legacy that you leave for others. So it isn't just about creating the future. It's also about who do you want to be for your ancestors who will live with the future. So I think that that's another important message that I kept taking away from what you were saying, which is that positive understanding of who we become as we become the creators of our future.
Absolutely, yeah. Such a powerful question that literally comes up for me every day, is that question of how do I want to be in the future, like, and who do I want to be in the future? Because if I look at the question that we usually ask is like, what do I want to have in the future, right? Is it the better car, or the better house, or the better relationship, or the better job, or the job promotion, whatever it is, right? This is really hard to control, right? And it doesn't make you happy as well, right? That's the research that shows that very clearly. But if you ask yourself, how do you want to be in the future? Things come up like, I want to be more kind, or more open, more curious. I want to be more loving. I want to be more fun, more empathetic, you name it. And I think these are all in our control, because we can decide today what are we going to do to really make that future self vision a reality, right? If I want to be more loving or more kind, right, what can I do today in this moment to move me closer to that vision? And that's very powerful. One of the great things that I'm taking away from your framework is that responding with wonderment and awe, right?
Yep.
That really fuels curiosity. And Allison, I think, when you were wandering through the forest, right, you already practiced that. Because there is a great exercise that I usually like to use, and that's inspired by my wife. She's a master gardener and a Reiki master as well, which is the pine cone exercise, right? It's a very simple but powerful way to practice that, gathering data through all senses. And I have a couple of pine cones actually here. And so if you look at a pine cone, right, which is something you can probably find everywhere in the forest, right? Just practicing that, gathering data through all your senses, right? You can, touch it, right? It has these sharp edges, and like it's round over here. You can smell it. You can, look at it, and so forth. And without judgment, right? That's important. Just observe, right? What are you seeing, right? And this already shifts your perspective from seeing it as an ordinary object to recognizing its complexity and uniqueness. And so the same applies to how we approach challenges. When we shift our mind state from, this is just a problem, to, what if I see this differently? What if I look at this and see it as an opportunity? What can I do to, make this problem go away? We already unlock new possibilities. And so, thanks for sharing that, gathering data through all senses. I think that's a really powerful way to go through your life.
One of the quotes that took us took our highlighters going, and Ben and I continue to ruminate on, is the idea of bracing ourselves what happens next instead of making what happens next, and starting to think about the notion of being a passenger versus a driver of the future. It's something that we see often in schools, where not just students, but also educators are feeling like it's this kind of hamster wheel, that they are supposed to be on this train, you know what I mean? And they don't necessarily know where it's going, and that kind of thing. And then you started to imagine that this moment where the future is a canvas of infinite possibilities. What masterpiece will you create? And so starting to see the juxtaposition of those two things next to each other, and starting to unlock the idea for a future ready mind state. So to me, I think that the interesting dynamic of how do we begin to move forward into that? So one of the things that we also were looking at were the qualifiers that you used for each of the principles or components that you were organizing as the sort of the frame for the rest of the what's next is now outline, where you talk about radical optimism and the notion of the word radical paired with optimism. Can you talk a little bit about that moment, about even the juxtaposition of the two words next to each other that was the bedrock of each principle?
Absolutely, yes. And coming back to your observation, I think this simple reframe moves people from passive spectators to active architects of their own future, right? From being a passenger and just waiting to receive like an instruction or guidance or something like that, towards being somebody who is active, who does something about their future, right? And it makes the future personal, actionable, and also filled with possibility. And so what I observe is that when people engage with this shift, they realize that they've been waiting for external forces a lot, right? Leaders, organizations, technology, my teacher, to define my path, right? Which I think is not the best way of creating your own future. But once you ask yourself, what future do I want to create? You take ownership. And that's really where the real innovation, but also the real change begins. And radical optimism, these two words, right, are probably something that creates this tension in the first place, right? Where you feel like, how can I be even optimistic in this world where I see a lot of crises happening, where I see a lot of uncertainty and so forth? How can I even be optimistic? And I want to go even further and be radically optimistic, because the word radical often, again, evokes thoughts of something extreme or bold or even disruptive. And that's for me intentional, because optimism, when truly practiced, requires a radical shift from how most of us are conditioned to think, right? We usually put people into these buckets of like, oh, you're a person that always sees the negative. You're the person that is the glass half empty perspective taker, right? Or we say like, oh, you are an optimist. You see the glass half full most of the time. You see opportunities. For me, radical optimism is going beyond seeing a glass half full. It's about seeing the potential to fill the glass even further. So it's not just looking at the glass as half full, it's seeing the potential to fill it even further, which means you're looking for the better. And really, that is for me the key. Radical optimism is not naive positivity, right? It's not about ignoring the problems. It's about seeing problems as possibilities, right? And a perfect example maybe was when I recently visited a refugee camp in Lesbos in Greece. And most conversations there centered around waiting, right? People waiting for the right papers to arrive, waiting for a decision from someone, waiting for a better future for most of the time. And when I met Abdul, he was a young man wearing a T-shirt. I'm not kidding. It said, "Create your own future." I even have a picture with him with that T-shirt. I stopped him and said, like, "Tell me more about this T-shirt. Like, what is it about?" He said, I'm just not waiting, right? He was teaching kids in the camp. He was organizing small businesses and business owners to help them get started. And he actively shaped a better reality despite the uncertainty. And so he was moving away from waiting to actually doing and moving forward and acting. And I think that's radical optimism in action.
I thought the three words that sort of hopped out at me after thinking about it a while is it's about thinking, doing, and learning. Because that's really the path that you're creating here with all the adjectives that you create. Each one of them has that kind of bold look to it. You're curious, but you're compulsively curious, which means you're not just passively curious, you go after it all the time. It's like an obsession with you. Each one of these, you're experimenting, but when you're perpetually experimenting, it means it's not over just because you started, and that you are continuously thinking about it. And it just seemed to me like each one of them gave you that sensibility of something bold and moving that was happening, action that was taking place. So it was about the heart, it was about the mind, it was about the moving toward and making something.
Yes, beautifully described, Bena. I think it's what I really tried to do is helping people to feel a way of being, right? And being in this world, right? And I think that's where you combine things like you're thinking about it, you're responding, you're feeling, you're literally being, right, as a human being. And so that for me is something very powerful to think about.
I also am imagining sort of this tension between being invited in and letting go. And as we start to move into the idea of the type of curiosity and experimentation that you're describing. It sort of feels like this this ethos. I'm just trying to figure out a way to sort of organize or frame it, but the ethos is one of not just sort of an active engager, inquirer, sort of experimenter, designer, creator in the world, but the notion of doing and celebrating and not being so beholden to your current right answer, to your current celebration or your current design. So can you talk a little bit about the tension of, I'm sure you've seen this in massive organizations, startups, and even in your own life. So
Yes. So Allison and Bena, can I be totally honest with you? To really truly engage with an unknown future, we need to let go of one specific thing, and that is certainty.
Yep.
And that can be uncomfortable. But it's also where creativity thrives, right? I think if we let go of that certainty that we think we know what's going to happen, or we think we're going to know the future, right? We need to let go of that. And one of the best ways to open people up to new possibilities is through small experiments, right? And that perpetual experimentation that you just, Bena, shared about. And so rather than waiting for a perfect plan, right? And we all love to make our perfect plans, right? Like, just think back when you planned your last vacation, right? We want to have the exact, date and time for when we go to a specific restaurant, where we're going to sleep, and what we're going to do, and which tours we are on, and what to visit, and which museum, and so forth. So we make the perfect plan. But I encourage people to try tiny, low-risk experiments to test an idea, right? And throw out that plan, because, again, like, that certainty is not something that's going to get you towards the future. It's letting go of that certainty. And so I think that also aligns with the habit of perpetual experimentation. Instead of being paralyzed by uncertainty, we act, learn, and we refine, right? And a great example comes from my work at Google. When we were designing the future of work during the pandemic, I was tasked to lead a group of leaders to really trying to reimagine how we want to work in the future. And there was no clear roadmap, obviously, for I think any of us human beings on this planet during the pandemic, right? We didn't have a roadmap. So instead of trying to predict what's the best, hybrid work model or future of work model, we ran hundreds of small experiments testing different, office setups, remote collaborations, team dynamics, and how they would work. So instead of assuming we had the answer, we tested our way toward a better one. And so that's something that we all can do. We just run small experiments, because for me, the path to the future is really paved with experiments.
And what's really interesting to me is that what you're talking about, given how people are thinking these days, or perhaps not thinking, is that you're suggesting that science is actually a series of perpetual experimentations, and that the idea of, I love the line where you said something like, attachment is the enemy of innovation. And I thought, yeah, and that's a problem every scientist has as well, which is, it's that the habit that we refer to is remaining open to continuous learning. It's like it's never there, it's always getting there. And everything, if it's seen as a learning experience, makes it possible. As opposed, if it's seen as a failure, it's done and you have nothing more to come from it.
I'm also thinking, Bena, it's as true for artists as it is true for classroom teachers. So if I'm designing and implementing a curriculum over and over and over again, I even can feel like it's getting stale as part of sort of shepherding or navigating this learning experience. And so I think that's the dynamic of how can we continue to have this kind of compulsive curiosity and perpetual experimentation, and how do we celebrate along the way, because I think the celebration and then the letting go is like, again, another sort of like interesting wrinkle that is so impactful across all ages and stages of expertise.
Absolutely, yes. I think we need to celebrate more the ways we have tried something, right? And the amount we have tried, right? Trying something new, right? That needs to be celebrated. If, it turns out to work or not work, doesn't matter. But like just the act of trying something new, like a new curriculum, a new conversation with a student, a different format of how we're teaching, a different space that we teach in, and so forth. All of those are experiments. And I think the more we try, the more we experiment, the more we learn. And I think that's something very powerful. And Bena, you shared something interesting, which is, yes, we figure out the world through experiments, right? Like just think back like a couple of 100 years, like how we thought the world works, right? Which has been proven mostly wrong today, right? Where if you look at maps from the 14th and 1500s, right, you see that those maps for sailors had all the monsters on the edges, right? Because back then it was known that, you shouldn't go there because there's monsters and the world is flat. So that was basically the common knowledge back then. And what have we learned through curiosity and courage, where some sailors went out beyond the known and beyond the monsters to figure out like, oh, the world is not flat. We don't fall off. And, there's other things that we can learn. We discover new land and so forth. And I think that's just something that we should remain at the forefront of humanity, is that curiosity combined with courage that we all have.
So we have to be very mindful of the monsters that we create, the mythic monsters that we create, because the mythic monsters that we create are the ones that serve to keep us contained rather than thinking beyond.
I'd love to talk a little bit about the conditions that potentially are paired with the idea of radical optimism or perpetual experimentation. So as Ben and I were reflecting, one of the areas that we sort of continued to wind our way through is the importance of trust. So you mentioned, for example, the idea of having a conversation with a student as an example. I mean, starting to think about like professional learning as part of a school, the opportunity for some conditions, whether you start to think that trust is an example, or I would just like to hear a little bit more about the conditions that are fundamentally necessary to make this come alive.
Yes, trust is such an important aspect of our lives, right? We go through life basically by trusting a lot of people, right? The food they serve us, the ideas they share with us, and so forth. And at Google, we looked at that very specifically in a way that we try to understand how teams innovate, right? And we looked at about 140 teams over a couple of months and really try to understand like, what is the distinction between a very innovative, productive, successful team and what is what matters in a not so successful and not so innovative team, right? And what we found is that it's all coming back to that notion of psychological safety, which is basically trust, right? And so when people were like vulnerable with each other, when they shared ideas at an early stage, when they questioned each other and so forth, they really built psychological safety. They built trust in the teams, right? And that really made them more innovative, more productive, and more successful. And so we can also instill that in other communities, in other environments, right? Like in a school community, right? You can try to build an environment of psychological safety where students feel safe enough to ask questions, to challenge their teachers, to come up with ideas that are raw, that are unfinished, and share them very early as well, right? That's one of the things that we ask our students at Stanford right at the beginning of the class is like, how comfortable do you feel sharing unfinished ideas, right? And not a lot of people are comfortable, right? Sharing an idea that's unfinished, that is still raw, still in development and so forth. At the end of the class, we ask them again, right? Like one of the questions is, how comfortable do you feel now to share an unfinished idea? And they throughout all the students, that number increases, right? They feel more comfortable to share ideas in an earlier stage. And that's a signal of psychological safety. That's a signal where they trust others to not destroy their idea, even when it's early and raw, but like really build on it and so forth. So I feel like this is something we can all do better, is building those environments where people experience psychological safety and trust.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also so incredible in that it transitions into all aspects of our organizations, whether it's in our families, in any kind of co-curricular endeavors that we embark on. The opportunity to not only have trust relationally, interpersonally, but also the idea of trust in my own ideas, trust in my own way of thinking or way of approaching the world. And so I think it's an inner world and an external world that are sometimes fueling each other, potentially in a more of a future ready mind state, or more of a like, I have to go in a bubble kind of
Absolutely.
state. So I think the last question that we wanted to sort of ask, as you continue to get us sort of primed for compulsive curiosity about the structures in our own learning organizations and systems, what are some of the assumptions that you've seen, whether it's in your work at Stanford or in some of the organizations that you consult with, that potentially can start to be unlocked, so that we can have more radical optimism flourish by design, by parameters?
Yes. So what I always envisioned in my life, what I try to do is building a curriculum that really is based on helping people to create a better future for themselves, which is a curriculum that really unlocks the abilities that are already inside us, right? Which is curiosity and openness and empathy and all of those, to really make us better human beings, right? Because curiosity leads to more opportunities, right? Openness, right? If you're an open individual, open to new ideas and open to new perspectives and so forth, leads to more opportunities. And so I think a couple of those assumptions that we have in education could be probably challenged, which is the first one, from passive consumption to active creation, right? How often do we see in a curriculum a teacher telling someone else what's right or wrong or what to do and so forth, instead of allowing students to actively create, imagine, and innovate? So that's something that I practice, for example, in my family, right? Instead of me cooking dinner, I love to cook and preparing dinner. Like, I allow my kids to actually do that, right? So they're in the creation of food and, like, experiment around and so forth, which is so powerful because they learn through doing. The second one I think is important, is from individual to collaborative, right? I think we need to focus more on working together, co-creation, collaboration, and so forth, because we as human beings are really bad in teamwork and doing things together, right? Because if you watch kids and specifically when they play, right, they mostly play alone, right? They play for themselves. So teamwork and co-creating and collaboration is something as a learned behavior, and we have to do a better job in encouraging and supporting that. And another one is probably from avoiding mistakes to encouraging experimentation, right? How often do we not allow our children or other people to learn, right? To make mistakes and learn from those, pushing boundaries and so forth. So I think we need to create environments where students can test ideas, where they can iterate and refine without fear. And so there is a great exercise that you can do. It's called a failure resume exercise, right? You create basically not your resume based on your successes that we all like to highlight, but based on your things that you've learned in your life, right? So they not list just achievements, but their failures along with what they've learned, which I think is very important, right? And then the last thing is to really encourage imagination, right? Instead of thinking about the past and thinking about, what has happened in the past, really thinking forward and imagine. Imagination is such a powerful human trait that we all have, but it's also underused, right? Imagining a better future, imagining how you want to be in the future, imagining who you want to be with. All of those things are imagining questions that we can ask ourselves, because as soon as we start to imagine, what the research says is that we're actually changing our behaviors in the right here, right now towards that vision that we want to see becoming a reality as well. So imagination is something we should allow our students to do even more in our educational settings.
So we can't thank you enough for spending some time with us, for crafting that book in such a way that it was accessible and approachable to such a wide range of audiences. So again, you can head over to your website to take a look at all of the opportunities.
There
So
it is.
Bena is holding the book up now. So we will send that along with this interview, just to get ways of continuing to touch base with you and how to follow your continued work. But I think the other part of this too is the story of how we continued to connect together. So on December 31st, the fact that you responded with a like and then I reached out, I think that's the moment that we continue to tell our story of what's possible and how we can continue to have a moment of conversation to continue to fuel the work that's happening in schools, in families, and other learning organizations to continue to make the world a better place in this moment. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, Bena, for what you're doing. And thanks for holding the book into the camera. I think it's a great reminder that you should always judge a book by its cover, right?
You want to hold that up, Bena? You want to hold it up again?
Tells you something different, because the cover for me,
here, I'll put it up again for you.
Has three things, right? The first one is you see a blurry image of yourself, which reminds you that you are in charge of your future, right? You decide how the future unfolds, right? And there is no clear picture about that. But as soon as you look closer, right, there might be some things that you notice about yourself and about your future self as well. The second thing is, as soon as you shift your perspective, right, soon as you look from a different angle at the book, right, there's these colors that are emerging, right? And it's a kaleidoscope of colors, which is a reminder. That's the second thing, is that as soon as you shift your perspective, you see something new, right? And mostly it's something more beautiful. The third thing is it's a shape, right? So it's not a perfect circle. It's not a perfect square. And that's a reminder that the future is shaped by you, and it is something very personal, right? Which will turn into something that is only your future. And so that's the three reminders that hopefully with that cover remind you that you're in charge of your future. and shift your perspective to see something more beautiful and shape the future that you want to see happening.
Well, thank you so much. That's such a beautiful way to end this whole conversation. And the book certainly is something we cherish. And what's really interesting is that today we decided that we were actually going to try, if we can, to paint that canvas of creation out of our conference.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.